Let's quickly review what we learned in the previous video. We learned about the second type of scroll-based timeline, view timeline. We learned that there are two ways to create a view timeline. You can create it as anonymous view timeline using the view function, or as named view timeline, in which you can define the subject element separately from the element to animate. The subject element is the element that we track the position of to progress the animation, whereas the element to animate is the element that we actually animate based on the progression of the animation. We also learned that in view timeline, we can't specify where to create the timeline. The timeline will always be created in the nearest scrolling ancestor. For example, in this example, I have a scroller element, and if I scroll down, you can see we see the element that we are animating. And since the element is a child of that scroller, and the scroller is scrollable, then the timeline will be created in that scroller, not on the whole page. We also learned how the animation range works in view timeline. We have 2 points. We have the start point, which is in the green, and we have an end point. The animation starts to progress as soon as the first pixel of the element enters the animation range. For example, if I scroll like this point when the element is inside the animation range, the animation starts. And it will continue to animate until the bottom of the element passes the end point. Look at that. So if I scroll, it will animate until the bottom of the element passes that point. In this video, we will focus more on how to specify these animation ranges. For example, by default, the animation range starts from the beginning of the timeline all the way to the end of the timeline. But you will learn that there are many different ways to specify the start and the end points of the animation range. But regardless which method we use for that, the same rule applies to all of them, which is the animation starts to progress as soon as the top of the element passes the start point, all the way until the bottom of the element passes the end point. But before we learn more about animation ranges, let's quickly review what we have in this example. So this example is almost identical to the one we had in the previous video. So in the HTML, we have a scroller element, and we are displaying a spacer, and then a box, and then a spacer. So we have some room for scrolling. Now if you go to styling, you can see that the scroller has some border, some width and height and overflow scroll. And if we scroll, the spacer is just a height with 100 viewport. And scroll up, you can see we are defining an animation to colored circle, which is like the previous video. The element starts from the color blue to red, and it turns from square to circle. And if we scroll here, the box we have has a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, and the background color defaults to white. And we are defining the animation, and we are giving it the name to scrolled circle, linear and forwards. And we are using view timeline by specifying the view function in the animation timeline. And if we scroll again, in the body, we are setting some background color. We are making it flexbox with a height of 100 viewport. If we scroll more, you can see we have some variables defined here for the colors. And that's it. Now let's scroll down to the box and learn about animation ranges. As we learned before, we can specify the animation range using the animation range property. So we can say animation range, and this is a shorthand for specifying the start and the end point. So you can, for example, say 0% to 100%. Or you can break it into two properties, animation range start and animation range end, but we will stick with the shorthand for now. First, let's learn about the default value. So the default value here is normal. And it's normal for the start and normal for the end. But if you just use normal, it will be used for both. Now if I save, you will notice no difference here. Look at that. But what does that mean? Using normal here means that the start point will be at the start of the timeline here, and the end point will be at the end of the timeline here. And we already learned about this, so nothing more to add here. Let's learn about the other option. You can also provide a number here. It can be a length, like in pixels, or it can be in percentages. For example, I can say 50% to 100%, which means the start point will be 50% from the bottom. So we start from here, it will be 50% like somewhere here, and the end point will be at 100%, which means at the end of the timeline here. So if I save, so you can now see that the start point at the middle of the scroller and the end point all the way to the end of the timeline. So if we try to scroll, you can see that the animation didn't start here because it will start as soon as it hits the start point. So if you scroll again, you can see the animation started all the way until the bottom of the element hits the endpoint. Let's try to modify the endpoint to make it 60%. You can see how the endpoint moved here. Let's try to scroll. The animation will start as soon as we hit the start point, the green one. So if I hit it like this, the animation started. Let's scroll again. It will continue until the bottom hits the endpoint. Like this. So the animation now is at 100%. But I know that might look a little bit confusing. And you might be wondering how the endpoint is below the start point even though we are specifying it at 60% and the start point at 50%. Don't worry, I will answer that in a little bit, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this point. So we learned about two ways to define the animation range. We can use the normal keyword, or we can use a value like a percentage or pixels. But there are more than that. We have what we call named animation ranges, and normal is actually one of them, but you can't do much with it. However, with the other options, you can control the animation range more. So what are they? We have cover, contain, entry, exit, entry crossing, and exit crossing. So let's try them one by one so we see how they behave. Let's start with cover. And if I save, you can see that the animation range start and animation range end is the same as using normal. And actually, yeah, cover is almost like normal, except that you can pass it values. For example, I can say 50% or maybe 100 pixels. And that goes for both the start and the end. So I can say cover 40%. But for now, let's just keep it cover. I will explain what these values mean in a little bit. So let's save. And again, it's the same. If I scroll, it works like before. Now let's see the other option, contain. And when I save, you can see that the start point moved here and the end point moved here. Let's scroll to see. So it will start once we hit the start point, all the way to here. Without getting into too much details here, how can we quickly describe this range? Now, based on its name, it means that the animation will start once the whole element is contained within the scroller. So once the whole element is visible, the animation will start, and before any part of the element leaves the scroller, the animation will be complete. Let me show you that again. So let's scroll up. So if I scroll, you can see that once the element is completely visible, it will start. So you can see that the animation start has moved 100 pixels from the bottom, which is the same as the height of the box. So if I scroll, so it will be complete here. It will be complete before any part of the element leaves. And again, it's 100 pixels below the top. And that's why it's called contained. It's contained because the animation will start and end as long as it's contained within its scroller. And you might be thinking, can't we just specify the end and the start points using numbers here? For example, I can say that for animation range start, it should be 100 pixels, which will move the start point from the bottom to here. And for the end point, we can say calc 100% minus 100 pixels, which will move it from the top down 100 pixels here. And you are completely right. And that's a valid way to do it. However, when you use contain, it will save you all these calculations. So you don't have to think about how many pixels I should move the start point or the end point. Not only that, but contain will always do the calculations dynamically. Meaning that if you change the size of the box to something else, like maybe you change it to 200 pixels when you click on it, animation range contain will pick up that. So it makes it easy to implement things dynamically, and it will save you time by doing all the calculations for you. Now let's get to the next one. Let's see entry. Now I saved, and let's take a look at the start and the end points. And you can see that the start and the end points are on top of each other. But how would that work? Let's try to scroll. And you can see that as soon as the element enters the scroller, the animation started. And that's because the top of the element already hit the start point. And it should continue all the way to here. And the animation here is at 100% because the bottom of the element passed the end point. So based on its name, entry means that the animation will start as soon as the element enters the scroller, and it will complete once the whole element is visible. So let's try that again. You can see when I scroll, the element started here. It will continue animating until we hit here. Now let's try exit. So after I saved, you can see that the start and end points are at the end of the timeline. Let's scroll and see how it will work. So the animation didn't start here, and that's expected because we didn't hit the start point yet. Now once it hits the start point, the animation started all the way to this point. And that's also expected because the bottom of the element hit the endpoint. So to describe this, based on the name, the animation will start as soon as the element starts to leave the scroller, and it will complete once it completely leaves the scroller. Now let's try the last two. We have exit crossing and entry crossing. Let's try exit crossing since we are at exit here. If I save, notice how the start point and the end point are still the same as exit. If we try to scroll, and it's the same as exit. And if we try the same for entry and entry crossing, we will find that entry crossing is the same as entry. And that's actually expected. If they are the same, then you might be wondering, why do we have them? And the answer is, they will be different once the element is bigger than the scroller. You can see that in this example, the element is smaller than the scroller. For example, it has 100 pixels height, but the scroller is way much more than that. Now, when your element is taller than the scroller, things will be calculated differently. And in that case, you will see a difference between entry and entry crossing and exit crossing. For now, that's all you need to know. I will show you an example of that later in this video. So these are all the named animation ranges. So we have cover, which animates the element across the whole scroller from the moment it appears to the moment it leaves the scroller. We have contain, which runs the animation while the element is contained in the scroller. We have entry, which animates the element as it enters the scroller. And we have exit, which animates the element as it's leaving the scroller. Now let's dive into each one to learn how we can control them even further. Let's start with cover. And for that, I'm going to split the animation range into two properties. So let's do that. Start and end. Let's start with cover. And we will also use cover for end. And let's save. By default, cover will be like this. The start point will be at the beginning of the timeline and the end point will be at the end of the timeline. But can we control that even more? And yes, we can do that by using the numbers that we can add after the animation range. For example, I can say here 50% and then I will say here 100%. But what does that even mean? To answer that, I would like to add some markers here to make it easier to explain how each animation range name works and how you can specify any point on them. But first, let's just remove this and keep it cover. So you can see I added here some controls to make it easier for me to add and remove markers. First, let's try to toggle the from to boxes. If I do this, you will notice now we see these kind of markers here. You can think of these as the start state and the end state. So in the blue one here, we have the start state. Imagine that the box will start from here and it will end here. Now when I toggle these options, I'm showing these states based on the current animation range. For example, if I switch it to contain, it will be something different. And let's try entry and exit. But let's get back to cover. From that, we can understand that animation ranges will be different based on the element we are animating, or to be more specific, on the subject we are tracking the position of, and based on the animation range name we are using. Let's take cover for an example. Here is the start state. So imagine that the box is here. Based on this, once the element passes this point, the animation will start. And once the bottom of the element passes this point, the animation will end. And let's imagine this. So here's the box. It will start like here. And it will move like this until it ends here. So we can understand that this is the initial state of the box and this is the end state of the box. And this makes sense for cover, because in cover, the animation will run across the whole scroller, from the moment it enters to the moment it leaves. But now, how can we use this information to set the animation start and end points? Let's think about it like this. So we know that the box will start from here, so this is the top edge of the box, and it will end here. And again, this is the top edge of the box. If we draw a line from the top edge of the box in the end state to the top edge of the box in the start state, like this, you can think of this line as the places that we can put the start point on. It will start from here at 0% and here at 100%. And now if we take the end state, meaning that we draw the line from the bottom edge here all the way to here, we can see this line as the places where we can put the end points on. So it will start from here 0% all the way here 100%. I know this seems a little bit confusing, but let me show you that in another way. Now let's say I want to change the start point for the animation. If I use 0% here, where do you think it should go? If I save, it will be at the start of the timeline, which is what we all expect. But now, what about the end? If I say 0%, where do you think it should go? Let's save and see. And look at that. It's not the same as the start point. It's actually below it. And if we try to scroll, look how the element is already at 100%. And that actually makes sense. Because when it's below here, when the top of the element is at the start, it will start the animation, but since the endpoint is below here, it will also be at the 100%. Because by the time the top element reaches the start point, the bottom of the element will also reach the endpoint. But now the question is, why the endpoint is not the same as the start point? And again, that's because of the way we calculate them based on the start and the end state. Let me show the from and to boxes again. Now the points we can set for the start point is along the line that starts from the top of the end state to the top of the start state. So let me show a line for that. So you can see it starts from here all the way to here. And that's the 0% for the start state. And that's why when we say cover 0%, the start point was set here. Now what about the end ranges? If I try to switch that, you can see that the ranges for the endpoint start from the bottom of the end state all the way to the bottom of the start state. So you can see this red line, we can only choose a point for the endpoint along that line. So it will be here 0% and it will be here 100%. So let me show both. So for the start point, we can pick from 0% here to 100% here. And for the endpoint, it will be from 0% here to 100% here. So based on that, what will happen if we set range start to 100%? Like this. Let's save and see where the start point, this green line, will go. Now if I save, look where the start point is. It's here. And again, if I show the states here, you can see it's at the top of the end state here. And that's why when we set 60% for the end range, it was below the start range. So let's try that again. So if I say here 50% for the start and 60% for the end. So again, if I save, you can see that the end point is below the start point even though it's 60%. So let's show the boxes and let's show the range lines. So you can see 50% of the start point is here along that line. And 60% for the end point, it's here because the line starts from here. So that will be 60% and here will be 50%. I hope this makes it clear. All I explained here works the same for all the other range names. But let's try a few more examples to make sure that it is as clear as possible. Now let's try entry. For the start, I'm going to set entry 50% and for the end it will be entry 100%. Now when I save, we get these points. Let's check if they are correct. So for the name, I'm going to choose entry and let's display the states. Now let's display both lines and let's check. So for the start, it's 50%. And this is the range line for the start points. And it's 50% and this is the middle, so this is correct. And for the end, it's 100%. We start from here 0% and here it's 100%. So yeah, that's correct. Let's try that. It starts the animation here and it ends here. Yeah, it works. Now let's try another example. Now what if we used two different range names? So for the start, I'm going to use entry 0% and for the end, I'm going to use contain 100%. Before I show you the points, let's see if we can expect where they will be. Let's start with the entry. It will be for the start point. So let's say entry and it's for the start. If we show the states and if we toggle the start, you can see that this is the ranges line and it will be 0%, which means the start point will be here. Now let's try for the contain. The contain is for the end range. So let's go here, say contain, and it will be for the end range. And it will be at 100%, so the endpoint will be here. Let's check if this is correct. So I toggled the points on, and we can see that this is the start point and this is the end point. So our answer was correct. So let's try that. We scroll. The animation starts here, and it will end here. Now for the next example, I'm going to set the start to cover, and this time I'm going to use pixels. So let's use 50 pixels. And for the endpoint, it will be entry. And I'm going to use calc here because I want to make it to 100% plus 100 pixels. So you can see you can play with the numbers and units any way you want. Again, let's try this ourselves first. So for the start, it will be cover 50 pixels. We are already on cover, and it's for the start. Let's show it, and it will be 50 pixels somewhere here. And for the end, it will be entry. Let's switch it to entry, and it will be for the end. So let's show the boxes. We can see the ranges line here. It's 200%. So if this is 100%, 200% will be here. And we should add another 100 pixels somewhere here. So let's see if that's correct. And yeah, it's correct. For the start, this is 50 pixels above the timeline. And for the endpoint, it's 200%. So we have 100%, 200% plus 100 pixels, which is here. So this is correct. Now let's try that. Works as expected. For the next example, we will use exit for both. So for the start, it will be exit 0%, and for the end, it will be exit 100%. Let's see what that should be. Let's set it to exit, toggle this, and let's show both. For the start, it will be 0%, which is this is 0% for the start, and 100% for the end, which is the same. Let's show the lines and see. And yeah, that's correct. So let's hide those. And you can see we are displaying the start point and the end point on top of each other. But do you notice something here? Isn't it the same as using exit? So if you remember, when we were seeing the ranges without specifying a number here, using exit without any number here had the same result. So let's try that. So if I remove 0% and 100% and save, it is the same. And the reason it's the same is because by default, when you don't specify any number for each range name, it will always use 0% for the start and 100% for the end. Which means if I use the shorthand like this, and I just say exit, it will be the same as exit 0% and exit 100%. So that's good to know. So let's try that. Yeah, and it works. But now, if we don't use any range name here and only use numbers, which range name will it use? For example, let's say I'm going to say 0% and 100%. Using numbers here without specifying the range name will always default to cover. So doing that will be the same as saying cover 0% and cover 100%. That's why I said cover is the same as normal, but not in all cases. So to say that again, if you use cover 0% and 100%, it will be the same as normal. But when you use values other than 0% and 100%, it will be different than normal. Now let's get to the case where the box element is bigger than the scroller. So let's modify the height to be 700 pixels. Now when I save, let's toggle the from to boxes. Now I'm using the name cover, and look how the box states are now bigger. Because remember, these states reflect the current height of the element. Now if we try, for example, contain, it will be like this. And if we try entry, it will be like this, exit, entry crossing, and exit crossing. Now I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to show you an example where it illustrates the difference between an exit and exit crossing and entry crossing. Let's start with entry. Now when I switch to entry, see where the start state is. So this is the start state. Now the end state is overlapping the start state instead of being displayed directly above the start state. So I expect it to be displayed like here, but it's actually starting from here all the way to here. Now let's see entry crossing. And look at that. So entry crossing has what we expect from entry. Again, let's see that. So the start state is here, which is the same as entry, but what's interesting here is that the end state displayed directly above the start state. You can see now this is the end state. So there is no overlapping between them. And if I'm going to display the ranges line, it will be like this. And that makes sense, because the ranges line for the start starts from the top of the start state to the top of the end state. And the ranges line for the end starts from the bottom of the start state, which is way below out of the viewport, which we can't see, all the way to the bottom of the end state here. So what that tells us is that using entry crossing is different when the element is taller than the scroller. Whereas when the element is smaller than the scroller, it will behave exactly the same as entry. And the same case for exit and exit crossing. So if I switch to exit, you can see there is overlapping between the start state and the end state. However, if I switch to exit crossing, there will be no overlapping. This is the main difference between them. So let's try this example. So for the start, it will be entry crossing 50%. So let's say entry crossing 50%. And for the end, it will be exit crossing 50%. Exit crossing 50%. Now let's save this and see. So for the start, it's entry crossing 50%. So let's select here entry crossing. Let's show states. Now let's select the start and show it. This is the ranges line for the start. It will be 50% somewhere here. And now for the end state, it will be exit crossing. So let's select exit crossing and it will be for the end and it's 50%. So now let's display the lines and this is how they look. So let's remove all the markers and let's try to scroll. So you can see when it hits the start point, the animation starts all the way until here. So the animation ends because the bottom of the element hits the end point. I know this is hard to visualize, but if you try a few more examples, it will be easier. Speaking of visualization, there's a great online tool that you can use to easily visualize your animation ranges. So first, let's hide the areas and labels. So we have this. In the controls, you can specify the animation range name. For example, for the animation range start, you can set it to any animation range name you want. For example, you can set it to cover, contain, entry crossing, entry, exit crossing, or exit. And the same is for the animation range end. And next to each animation range name, you can specify the number. But in this case, it's only in percentages. So in this example, we have cover 0 and cover 100. And you can see this is the cover 0 and this is the cover 100. So you can think of these as the end and start states. This is the start state and this is the end state. And based on them, you can visualize the ranges line for the start and for the end. For example, this is for the start and this is for the end. And you can test that. For example, let's try to scroll. You can see this is the element we are animating and we scroll. Once its top hits the start point, it will start animating. And you can see the percentage of the animation. It will animate like this until the bottom of the element hits the end point. And you can try other animation ranges. For example, let's try contain and let's try for the end exit. So it will be like this. It will start here all the way to here. And let's change the number for the contain. So let's move it to 20% and let's move the exit 50% down. So we can say -50. So let's try that. So the top of the element hits the start point, so it starts to animate all the way until this point. And you can also specify the size of the subject. For example, now we have it smaller than the scroll port. We can set it to taller, and it will be like this. So I encourage you to play with this tool. It will help a lot with understanding how the animation ranges work. So I will put a link to this tool in the description. Now last but not least, let's learn about View Timeline Inset. With View Timeline Inset, you can change the length of the timeline. So here's the timeline we are using. With Timeline Inset, you can specify two values, one for the top and one for the bottom. If the value is positive, it will push the timeline down, causing it to get smaller. But if it was negative, it will pull it up, making it taller. So you can think of this as a margin. So this is the top margin. Now the other value is for the bottom. If you give it a positive value, it will push it up, making it smaller. But if you give it a negative value, it will pull it down, making it taller. Again, you can think of it as a margin bottom. You can specify the value in the view function here. Now remember, in the view function, you can specify the axis for the view timeline. For example, you can use inline or block. Not only that, but you can also specify the inset. So the first value will be for the top. For example, let's set it to 100 pixels. And the second value will be for the bottom. Let's, for example, set it to 100 pixels. And then you can, for example, specify the axis. But for now, let's just use the default. Now this is for anonymous view timeline. If you are using a named view timeline, then you can use a property for that. It's called View Timeline Inset. And it's the same. You can, for example, say 100 pixels for the top and 200 pixels for the bottom. But since we are using anonymous here, we can remove this. Now before I save, if I toggle this, this is what we have. Now let's save and see how this will change. See how it looks now. So this is our scroller, and we are pushing the timeline down by 100 pixels, like this, and we are pushing it up by 200 pixels like this. So now this is our timeline. So you can see that once you change the timeline length, everything will update accordingly, including the state boxes and the range lines. And let's try to scroll. So you can see it starts here all the way to here. Now this will be useful when you want to make the timeline length different than the scroller. And finally, we get to the end of this video. In the next video, we will learn about a property that gives us a lot of flexibility when creating scroll animations, which is timeline scope.